I should have just let this run. Usually when I hit the Zoom room, it just starts and then I just record. And it would have been awesome to have a 15-minute conversation about Rush and ecology in the
Yeah,
video.
that would be.
I'm so glad you guys are all here for our Be Better Club. You know that I sort of select these selfishly, these topics. And today I want to talk about IACUCs, so Institutional Animal Care and Use Committees. We can talk bigger than that about animal ethics if you want, but about animals and research in particular. And I have a particular reason for this because I've had an ongoing question about UCF's IACUC, and I'm never really sure how hard to push on things here at the institution. But we had a podcast, and there's a million themes in here we could talk about. We could talk about the 3 R's. We could talk about animals and research generally. We could talk about translation issues. We could talk about regulatory bodies, whatever's interesting to you all.
I want to open the floor to anybody else first before I start yapping.
They're all interesting. I'm too indecisive to pick one.
Yeah.
Well, I'm curious why you chose this specifically, because our Be Better Club is environmentally related.
Yeah, environmental and agricultural ethics, specifically.
Okay.
Yeah. No, this one, it's hard for me not to see animals and animals in research as part of the agricultural and environmental purview. Because even though a lot of them, probably most of the animals, non-human animals we use in research are for biomedical reasons, there are all kinds of applications outside of that domain, and animal welfare is an environmental issue. At least on my reading, I read animal ethics as part of a bigger environmental ethics, which is why we spend a little bit of time in class, at least, talking about those tensions between natural bodies like rivers and lakes and mountains and specific non-human. Although we have a separate class on animal ethics, which I'll teach next year. But yeah, my reason was that, and also selfish, because I learned that, more selfish even. I wanted to be part of our institutional animal care and use committee, which is like the IRB equivalent to handle research animals, because I was trained in that space, and I know it well. And so I thought that I could be valuable in that committee. But it turns out that UCF only wants people on the committee who work with animals in research. And that is against NIH and OLAW, which is an acronym, federal regulators' definition of what an institutional animal care and use committee is. They define a 5-member committee, and 2 of those, I even wrote down the language if I can find it. 2 of those are 1 member who's not affiliated with the institution, and another whose primary concerns are in a non-scientific area, like ethicist, lawyer, or member of the clergy. And UCF has neither of those 2 members on their committee, unless you count the veterinarian. Since we don't have a veterinary program, our veterinarian on the committee is in fact not a member of the institution, technically. But I don't think that's really the spirit of the law. But there's that missing gap, like the role that ethicists could play, or clergy members or lawyers could play on an animal care and use committee. So that's my, that's just to show you all my cards. That's why I'm interested, because I think I'd like to see that committee change. And I had a student group last year do a research project where they, to their credit, they actually phone called almost all of the institutional care and use committees across the state of Florida system and asked about the constitution of their committee, who's on it, how visible they were, like if you could reach out to the people involved. So they did like a transparency survey, and we're kind of behind the curve vis-a-vis our peers. So there's practical reasons, but I think there's also interesting ethical reasons to talk about this. So
yeah,
that's an answer.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I'm curious, so to go back to the very beginning of what you said, the animal ethics kind of being an environmental ethics for you, even regarding, like clinical, like I remember in the podcast they talked a lot about animal testing in like a clinical setting, which is it could be viewed as very detached from ecological systems thinking, and but you're still pairing them together, which means, is there like kind of like a sub idea that animals themselves are the environment regardless of where they are placed?
Yeah, that's a really interesting. I Two things to say. I think from a disciplinary perspective, and Josh and Ian, I don't know how you feel about this, but like from a disciplinary perspective, I think oftentimes those are separated. So if we think about research ethics, that's a different domain than animal ethics, or there's sort of a separating out. But
Mhm.
In the way that we this semester have talked ecologically, it feels weird to me to be like, well, there's animals in natural spaces, and then there's animals in labs, and those one's environmental and one's not. Like the differences between the built and the natural environment, but it still seems to me like they fall under the purview of questions of environmental ethics broadly, most broadly construed. But maybe that's too generous.
No, I feel like there is something else there, which is human management of other organisms. So when we talk about environmental ethics, we're always talking about human impacts or management on ecosystems. And same thing with animal ethics. We're pulling animals or creating animals for our specific needs. So in a way, the ethics is less about just the environment and more humans shaping the environment to their will. And so maybe we're looking for ethics in that.
That might make sense. Yeah,
And
this gets us
since
to think.
the theme is also agricultural, and so much of agriculture is literally humans managing the environment, like you said, I think it definitely can fall under that, because even if we're not like farming the animals that we use in labs, we're still like using them for our benefit the same way we would use like farmed animals. So I think it could kind of also fall under that umbrella.
Mhm.
That would make sense to me. Yeah, and a lot of the same strategies we use for breeding and cross breeding and manipulating behavior and physiological outcomes for farm animals, we do the same thing with laboratory animals.
Mhm.
The onco mouse is a great example of this, where we've just basically genetically modified mice to have specific cancers, to be guaranteed to get specific cancers, and then we breed those in laboratory settings and sell them to researchers who need to study a specific cancer trajectory. Um, so yeah, we're doing the same kinds of manipulations in both those contexts. But again, like depending how you chunk the world up, like research ethics is distinct and is regulated differently than agricultural ethics, regulated by different federal agencies.
So to add, I agree with those three explanations of like why this falls in the realm of environmental ethics or animal ethics. And to add a third perspective here, we think of IACUC, and the podcast mostly talked about mice in a lab, but we think of IACUC as lab experiments. But if you want to do a field study, you still need to go through an IACUC if you're going to work with wild animals. So as somebody who went to UCF and actually navigated the IACUC system at UCF for wildlife ecology, it seemed very much not necessary. There was this disconnect. You could tell that the system was in place for mice in a lab, and that they were trying to squeeze field studies into this, and it didn't fit the same way. So, perhaps that's a separate issue of just logistics. But I think this does bring the environmental ethics and wild animal ethics back into the conversation, because you literally need to go through the IACUC process to even um, do an observational study of any vertebrate animal in a college setting. So even if you just wanted to go out and count birds, technically, you're supposed to have an IACUC for that.
Yeah, that's so interesting because it's the same problem we're facing with the IRB, which is built to regulate medical research. But if you do, like a lot of my graduate students do social media research, so they scrape user data. Technically, they have to go through IRB, but IRB treats those as exempt studies because there's not regulations in place to govern in the same way. And I wonder if it's a regulation issue or if it's just a personnel expertise issue in the case of field. And I don't know anything there. It's an interesting question.
I would like to quickly just touch on the thing you started off talking about, how, selfishly you wanted to talk about this because you're interested in modifying / improving the UCF system. And
Yeah.
I will be honest, it always struck me as strange how it is regulated by the people who are likely going to need it the most, and that there seems like some sort of inherent bias there. Like of course you're going to approve the stuff for you and your friends, right? That's a problem that we've seen played out in many systems. And it screams to having some sort of external or non scientist involved in the process. So I'm really disappointed that UCF has not gotten gotten better in that regard. And the podcast even mentions stats, right? Um,
Right, right, right,
we
right.
were joking before the call that most scientists don't actually know math, but I think that's real, honestly. And if one of the ways to help with the three R's, the replacement, reduction, and refinement, is to have intentionally um, efficient experimental design, you need statistical experience to do that. Not having someone with a stats background on the IACUC committee seems like possibly problematic in that regard.
Yeah, Ian, that's well said. I think the other thing that strikes me is that since the 1980s anyway, there's been a push more and more for opacity for those committees. So none of us, I think, not very few of us at the university know where animal experimentation is happening or what kind of experimentation is going on. We don't know the reporting structures that should be in place. It's covered up, right? And that's under the guise of protecting the institution and our researchers. And we can talk more about why that's the case. But that strikes me as a big problem from an animal welfare perspective, which again is like IRB, the whole point of IACUC. Yeah, and I get that they don't want me on the committee because I tend to lean maybe towards the animal rights direction, and maybe that's not great. But other institutions have had an ethicist, like a university ethicist, who has been advisory on a lot of these committees, and it just seems like that's a healthy approach. And I'm surprised too, given how overly compliant. Josh, go ahead.
Now, Madison, I don't know if he's still on it, but in Madison, which is a huge animal research university, Robert Streifer, one of the philosophy professors, who's a vegan, was on the committee. So they do have some like,
Yeah.
though they maybe had to. I mean, he was a responsible member, so he didn't just disapprove of every experiment, obviously.
Well, that's what struck me when I first asked and was told in no uncertain terms, no. That there's a sense that people like me, philosophers maybe, or folks, ethicists, have an implicit bias, and we're not, like I think is obviously the case, trained to hold that middle ground and to evaluate arguments. So yeah, to know that there are other cases out there, philosophers and ethicists, even vegan philosophers and ethicists, who have done that role successfully, it's good to know.
There was also, I was quite involved in the animal rights stuff there, and there was a quite active anti-animal experimentation thing. And so the university did all kinds of stuff. But I also remember one of the arguments that one of these guys in the community made was because you're supposed to evaluate, like you're supposed to be considering like whether the suffering or the pain that these animals are experiencing is necessary for the experiment, right?
Yep.
And he always had this argument that it's unacceptable that anybody on the committee is not a vegetarian, because he didn't think that if you're not a vegetarian, then you're clearly not capable of. And he used to make this argument in all the public forum all the time. I mean, he wasn't well liked, of
Sounds like a
course,
delight.
but yeah,
That sounds
he
like
was quite hard to get along with, even though he was on my side.
Yeah, it seems like the opposite problem, right? Like it's almost a disrespect of other people's other members' capacity to make balanced decisions. But there's such strong feelings around this space that I can understand the hesitancy. And there's been all this public pushback for decades against on the animal rights side, against animal experimentation, a few instances of which have turned violent. And so that's been bad. But also folks, student activists and others have uncovered really terrible things we've done. Did you both probably know or remember the University of Pennsylvania's head trauma clinic studies back in the 90s, 80s and 90s?
Was this the one with chimpanzees?
Yeah. And animal rights groups, I can't think of which one now, broke into the lab and stole a bunch of video footage and gave it to the media. And the video footage was of researchers like intentionally under no experimental design, like just causing head trauma to chimpanzees under restraint and then laughing about it. Yeah. And so here was a moment where these activists knew this was happening and needed proof. And so they did this thing, they broke into the lab. And that was important because it stopped this obviously unethical practice, and that led to this huge national pushback. But it also led to this moment of opacity for these IACUCs, where they're risk averse now. They're like, everybody's going to break into our labs and steal our videos or whatever, as if everybody in the world is doing that kind of level of intentional suffering, right? Which I think very few researchers are doing. So it's a tricky space, and so part of it is a trust relationship, trying to build that kind of transparency back into IACUCs. And then I've got lots of other questions. Like, I don't know if everybody has an IACUC or if it's only larger research institutions. Ian, does Rollin have an IACUC that you're involved in?
They do, and I'm kind of waiting for the day, any day now, where they ask me to join. And then I have mixed feelings about that for all the things we're talking about right now.
For sure. Yeah.
It sounds like they might be different though, like UCFs to Rollins, if they're very culturally dependent of like the actual university, then you might run into a series of your own issues, like contrary to Dr. Beavers. Do you know any of the people on the committee that you would like feel that there's a conflict of interest, or you're also an ecological background, you're a philosophy background, so there's that.
I do. I think there might be, like Dr. Beaver was saying, that, there might be this implied bias for ethicists that they would lean towards the animal rights in many cases. I think there might be this implied bias towards ecologists leaning in favor of whatever the experiment is. Like, go get the data, we'll figure out the implications later, right? That kind of thing. So I don't know if anybody fits that mold perfectly, but I'd say in the broad field of ecology, more people probably fit that mold. Maybe I'm also just a little skeptical and negative about this, but
that would be an interesting empirical project to do, is like, what percentage of ecologists or environmental studies or environmental science folks lean towards animal rights versus animal use or something.
Well, one wrinkle to add to this, and I don't know if this is common knowledge, but IACUC is only required for animals that are vertebrates, meaning, mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fish. So if you wanted to study octopus, you don't need an IACUC for octopus studies. If you want to go study praying mantis or things like that, not needed. So we'd have to separate ecologists who study invertebrates versus vertebrates, and interesting stuff.
Now, I had very limited time earlier to read anything more about animals and research, but one thing I did find, there was no year on the publication, so I don't know if this is current or not, but it said that the Animal Welfare Act specifically excludes birds, rats, and mice. So like it purposely excludes some of the most common like experimental animals from the Welfare Act. It includes just all other warm-blooded vertebrates, I think was what it said, but it excludes those ones.
Yeah, I think that is still the case in terms of the law. I think that Animal Welfare Act was 1964, and I don't think that's been updated since, as far as I know. And that original wording did exclude those animals because under the Welfare Act, that's how you would lead an animal cruelty charge. And you could imagine a world in which you had animal cruelty cases around mice. There's just billions of research, and that's challenging. And yet IACUC still is in the place of that regulation, still governs use. The podcast was talking about small welfare changes. So like not picking a mice or a rat up by the tail, but like in a cup or a tube. Some of these small changes, I think that's where IACUC has been pushing. It's like small welfare changes have a huge impact on the animal's life, because really these are designed, born and bred in captivity and euthanized in captivity. It's a whole life cycle in a lab by design. And so anything you can do across that relatively short life cycle is great. So this is enrichment programs and housing quality and all of these little changes freeing the animal is obviously not on the table because you can't release genetically modified mice in the environment. But yeah, so I think there's reasons why the Welfare Act includes big companion-y sorts of animals and excludes small
Mhm.
pest animals. Birds is an interesting question too. But-
Yeah. If it's like all birds, like it's such a wide variety of different species.
Well, and we know so much more now. So Ian mentioned like octopi and cephalopods. Like we know so much more now about behaviorally and let's say cognitively or neurologically about these animals and their intelligence equivalents that it's really weird to think these aren't governed by an IACUC because they've got the same behavioral capabilities, environmental awareness, and pain thresholds and whatever else as a lot of other birds that are covered. So I think as is the case, usually the science leads us to changes in regulation. And the thing that directs the science, at least on my read, is the ethics. So as people have developed a clear understanding of the potential value of octopus and their relationships to them, that's led to changes in science and more focus on them biologically. And in theory, that would lead to regulation. But that timeline for vertebrates took a long time. So I don't know.
Yeah, the cephalopods one is a compelling one because I immediately, when you said invertebrates only, I was like, what about octopus?
Yeah.
And funny side anecdote, my brother works in a seaside restaurant in South Florida, and they run a grilled octopus special, and he won't sell it. But he did sell it one time, and he sold it as the world's smallest sea creature and potato salad. To try to dissuade the people from buying it, which was his own funny form of activism. But and then of course it's arguable if it's the world's smartest sea creature. But the funny thing is like the empathy towards the octopus because of its intelligence, and then it's not used in this research as like adequate, I guess.
Yeah. Well, but again, I think I think there are pragmatic reasons why octopi are excluded because again, the reason we do animal testing is legislated, I think. That is to say, in the US context anyway, we have to do animal testing before we move on to human models, human testing, for all kinds of biomedical treatments. And that is because of human atrocities and research that happened back in World War II and around. So we've got this modeled setup that we have to use translational models to develop protocols that are safer for humans when we test on them. And so we can't use octopus in that way because neurologically they're so distinct. Right? But mice and rats and birds and chimpanzees are all approximations of humans biologically. And so we can do translational research.
Okay.
And this is a big area of interest for mine, and I've never found any good data on it, but I have a strong intuition and little nuggets of data to suggest we do this for moral reasons, but we don't do it for good scientific reasons. The idea that we directly translate what we do, research experiments on non-human animals, to humans in any successful way is a story we tell, and it's not data-driven. There are some instances where we can say, like, we developed a drug in mice and it translated over to human beings, and that's great. But I think for most protocols, including psychological protocols, like in psychology, there's only legal reasons, moral reasons, but not scientific ones.
Not scientific to do research on a non-human species before.
Yeah, because of the problem of translation. So
Okay.
there is a whole bucket of research I want to set aside for just a second about research on animals for animals, right? So if you're trying to design new habitats or you're doing behavioral studies or whatever, and trying to understand the animal disease model, like in veterinary science. But translational research, I think, is really tricky. Again, I haven't found any good data to say 60% of experiments we started in animals translate really well to human products.
It's probably another, if you showed up trying to get involved in the committee and then said, I'm really interested in this, they were probably like,
they'd be like, no.
red flag, red flag.
It's a complete red flag.
Yeah.
I completely understand. And yet I think somebody needs to be asking those questions.
Absolutely.
And somebody who's partly in charge of animal welfare, which really is only 3 people at the university.
Wow.
And they report biannually to our director, our vice provost for research. But the IACUC at UCF is 3 people and a veterinarian. It should be 5 people in a veterinarian, I think. according to the federal law. Yeah. And part of the problem with this is not just me being grumpy, although that is a problem, but it's also, Ian, you mentioned the statistics angle. I think that's so important because almost every bit of our animal research is coupled to some other discipline, right? So there's folks who work directly with animals, but then there's the engineers who are designing the protocols and the biologists who studying at species level. And there's like all these interdisciplinary connections. And if it's not transparent, then there's no opportunity to build those relationships. And I think you get worse outcomes from that, both from the welfare side and from this like discovery side. Yeah.
Right. I think the point about the mice picking up thing too, the small incremental changes are significant as well for an ethicist to be able to have insight into, because
Yeah.
for people who are very, if they're desensitized or they are lacking in non-human empathy towards their specific subject because they've just been around and testing it so much, they might not see the value or what effects they're supposed to have. They might just be like, oh, these animal rights people want me to love this mouse, and so now I have to do this as a rule. But what it really could possibly be doing is changing the person's, especially as more researchers come on, and that's just a basic principle now. It's no longer the people who were forced to change their habits. It's now just the precedent that's set. You change your relating to whatever animal you're studying. If you are not allowed to treat it a certain way, I wonder if they may just internalize an ethic and don't not even consider it anymore.
Yeah, that makes really good sense. Yeah, trying to enculturate those changes rather than mandate them
But
has a different effect.
yeah, and by enculturating, also perhaps hopefully preventing a compounding of other unethical or careless habits. That could lead to something like bashing a chimpanzee's head.
Yeah, yes. And that case is so old, and you'd think at this point I would have a better story to tell you about why that happened, and I don't.
Like I'm imagining, like, if I were a chimpanzee researcher and I didn't have any rules, and I could just like grab it by its ear and yank it into where I needed it to go, I would eventually be like, why couldn't I bunk it in the head and see what happens? But if I were, I don't know what the protocol for chimps are for handling them, but if I were, required to handle them a certain way, if I'm picking something up gently or whatever over and over again, there's something happening there called respect.
Yeah.
And then that respect makes it impossible for me to do something disrespectful.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Yeah, chimpanzees are a particularly weird case because they're by all accounts, and this is from the animal rights side and also the biology side, miserable to work with in the lab setting because they're so high strung and stressed out and so intelligent that they end up getting these behavioral markers that just make them functionally unhandleable, which is why was it? Yeah, I feel like it was Francis Collins. That name's stuck in my head now. A decade or more ago, led the charge at NIH. He was the head of NIH at the time, I think. And he led the charge to ban federal use of chimpanzees in federally funded research. And I think it's now the case that it took decades, but all of those chimpanzees, there were 50 or 60 of them in federal care for laboratory use, have now all been, let's call it archived, but moved to a sanctuary. And they're, as far as I know, the federal government has fully cleaned itself of chimpanzee research on its funded models. Still happening in private industry, of course, but
Okay, private is a whole.
Yeah, and I remember thinking about the reasons why and thinking like, oh, this is a win for animal ethics. And Collins and other ethicists around at the time had said it is, but that's not the reason we banned it at the federal level. We banned it because it's just such an expensive pain in the ass. Excuse me, French. They're just so hard to manage that just practically you're not getting good data out of the energy, the money we're putting in. So you need a different one. And that was also the same time when we were developing really much stronger in vivo and in silico models. So we didn't need to study non-human animals. And that's my hope for the future of this space, is that in vivo medicine is only a few decades old now, because we only know enough about the genome to be building organs on what was the description she used? Organs on a chip, organs on a something.
I didn't make it that far.
In the podcast, we can use what we know of cellular biology. Oh, nice, Ian, thanks.
Yeah, I think we
Oh.
referenced this one in a about 2 semesters ago when I think it was part of a podcast actually. So I bought the book and real easy read. Well, real good read.
Nice, nice.
But yeah, you were saying in silico, sorry.
No,
Yeah,
no,
I
that's
remember when they talk about that in the podcast, but I don't remember like what they actually used to describe it. Just that like we're like using cells in place of like using humans or other
Yeah,
animals
yeah,
or
yeah.
something.
Yeah, I think it's called organ on a chip. And basically the idea is we can build not only a single cell or divisions of cells, but cell interaction in silico, like on a chip.
Yeah.
And we can model what's happening in the body in vivo. So not in vitro, not in somebody's body, but in a lab setting. And the better we get at that, the less likely we'd have to do a lot of experiments that we normally do on, say, a rat or a mouse on a living organism, but on this organ on a chip model. And then the other exciting thing that I think has been a long time coming now is what they describe as in silico, which is simulation or artificial models for animal research. And we do this a lot. I think veterinary science has moved to this model. I remember a story that my dad used to tell me, because my dad's a veterinarian. He said they used to be trained as new scientists on animals. And my dad was really hesitant the first time he had to do a surgery because he'd never done one before. And he was doing it on this live thing in front of him. And he said his professor was like, "Cut, Beaver, cut," just like get in there and do it. And a lot of those animals ended up in multiple cutting procedures. So an animal was a training animal. And so somebody would train on an incision procedure. They'd let it heal enough so that they could do another cutting procedure. And they would just do that until the animal died.
Oh,
Yeah.
God, that's brutal.
And they wouldn't let veterinarians back in the day
It's okay. It's fine.
adopt those animals or take them out of the setting. It was just they were the trainers, and their job was like the rat in the lab to be born and bred and disposed of in that protocol. And it is awful, except that and I don't think anybody was like, yeah, let's do this, right? They were thinking, what other way do we have to train veterinarians who need to then go in the future and save lives? So this was a sacrificial animal in the traditional sense. So now we've got these models where you've got really good like artifice, right? That you can practice sutures on that feels and looks and acts and performs like a living animal, but it's like a model that you use, right?
Yeah, what digital model?
There are digital models, especially in human medicine, but a lot of these are physical, like
Okay, and like very
like life,
Okay.
like think CPR dummies, but for animals. Right?
okay.
So you
That's
can practice suturing techniques
yeah.
on something that feels and looks and responds like.
Oh yeah. And this isn't even, I'm not trying to just say it's brutal for, my ethical opinions, but just thinking of incisions over and over just makes my whole body want to curl up into a ball.
Well, and you've got to think how brutal it is for for folks in training, so
Yeah.
students to have to go through that too. So just psychologically, like knowing this animal's been there and done this a
Yeah,
bunch of times, and then to do it again and know that you're not good at it because you're learning, like that's stressful for anybody learning anything,
yeah.
but especially in that relationship.
I've
So a
just
lot
got
of
it
those-
hard. They have it rough.
For sure. A lot of those fields have changed in really good ways, and partly because of what we know about cellular technologies, like genetic technologies, and what we're able to build. So there's a small hope that, like they said in the podcast, we're breeding too many animals, and so we like breed all these generations of mice and then we euthanize them en masse because they're not getting sold fast enough or whatever. I think little by little there's this push to breed fewer and fewer animals. I'm hypothesizing now because I don't have any data on that at all.
Well, there's obviously like a very strong movement for like younger people who are very anti-animal testing, like specifically in cosmetics. That's very well known, and then like PETA. But it sounds like there's a lot more nuance to this argument than just like ban the lab, stop doing it, because a lot of the responses to those people are like, well, what about like medicine, right? Cosmetics being superfluous to like human develop, like we don't need lipsticks, but that has its place. But I like the idea of not just banning altogether, even though that sounds like what's being like called for by these like activists sometimes.
Right.
But what the actual labor is like negotiating.
I think, and that's why I think, and with some bias, that ethicists play a really important role because we're trained to develop arguments and see other perspectives and respond to them. And that process of negotiation, just what it is to do animal care and use review, I think,
Mhm.
is to say, here's this protocol. Like I might personally feel really strongly that you should do it at all. But if you've made a compelling argument that it needs to be done, there's no way to replace the animal, reduce the number of animals used, or refine the protocol. If that's the best you can do, and you're making a case this is going to yield some, societally beneficial results, then that's what you've got, right? And I think that's those sorts of negotiations are really important. But to Dr. Biazza's point, like it can't be done by folks who are invested in the research. That doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah.
It seems like that implicit bias is just too strong. And there's
How do you even make that argument to people who are like, yeah, we know. That's why we don't want you here.
yeah. Again, I think the argument has to be everybody cares, and I think this is true. I can't imagine that everybody on an IACUC and at the university cares about animal welfare. They're trying to balance things out, but nobody is like, we don't care a lick about animal pain, right? I just think that would be a weird position to hold for any kind of researcher. So I think that's the argument to lean into. Like, I hear you. Like, you don't want a PETA person. In fact, you say those 4 letters to an IACUC and they're going to run the other way, right? But they don't want a PETA person on the committee, and yet they need a voice who is prioritizing animal welfare against the research. But one vote among others. I mean, that's how the committees are set up. So I think it's really interesting. We could talk a lot more about IACUC and OLA in the executive branch and public health service policies around that. But the idea that the committee is defined as having 5 members, 2 of whom are not involved in animal research, seemed really important to me. And surprising here at UCF, because I know we've had a long history of student activism on the side of animals. I was reading just this morning that back in 2016, UCF students collected like 5,000 signatures to pressure Aramark, the food company, to change their husbandry practices for chickens that they were then selling to UCF for food.
How'd that go?
It seemed to work out really well.
Did they make some changes?
What were the things that they wanted them to change specifically?
It was about animal housing, so I don't know the details. But the news report that I was reading suggested that Aramark made these changes and the students like won. So stories like that are pretty rad. I mean, it's really empowering to think you could have a positive change, again, in these little ways. It's not like maybe some students were. It's not like they were banning selling chicken to eat on campus. They were like, if you're going to sell chicken to eat on campus, it might as well be as cruelty-free as it can be. Right? And our Aramark was at that point, and probably still is, too big to really prioritize that. So students pushed. There's
a certain amount of grace that needs to be had for when you're negotiating some sort of advocacy. And I think I'm sure there's plenty of vegans on that coalition of students who would prefer if no chickens were being fed to people anyway. Yeah. But I like that they can because there isn't very black and white thinking now. I would say people are very all or nothing. Like if you stand for it, or if you don't stand for it, but you do this, then you stand for it. Yeah. Yeah. So I can see a vegan argument to make you feel very terribly guilty that you're actually supporting killing chickens still, and so you're a chicken murderer or something crazy. Right. And I wonder what that inner conflict could have been, but I do like seeing that negotiation have grace. So that's just the word for it. Yeah, I like that too. Grace for others and grace for yourself, I guess, in that purview. Yeah, it can't be perfect, and it really shouldn't be black or white, because then you're really not accounting for another half of the experience if you're viewing yourself in direct opposition to one other thing, at least. But it applies to a lot of other issues as well, but it seems to, especially right now. It's sometimes hard to have conversations with community or family members who feel so strongly about one position that they don't want to see the other, or that they assume if I make clear one of my political opinions, all of my other ones are well known now. Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm sure that's probably what's happening from our IACUC chair, who sees a ethicist. Think they're gonna watch?
Poor Josh and Ian. Josh and Ian know this. Like, there are like 3 people who view our YouTube channel, and one of them's my mom. So I would doubt it, but
Okay.
I kind of hope they do
Oh,
because
that's
I
kind of
think.
nice that your mom watches them.
Hi,
I
hi,
don't-
Mrs. Beaver.
Hi.
I don't know that she actually does, but that would be great. Yeah, I think. Yeah, there's so much to say here, and I think if we all sort of have a sense of what IACUCs are meant to do and find that balance on the committee, that can be really powerful. But then there's all these other questions, back to your point, Ian, like, maybe we've got a good handle on biomedical research and not in non-human animals, but then field studies in biology are at the edge. And I don't know if that's a regulatory problem or if that's a committee focus problem. Lots of things to look at next, I guess.
I've been while we're having this conversation, trying to find out if our IACUC committee is listed anywhere on our website or our internal facing website that you need a ID to get into. I
Yep.
can't find it anywhere, so now I have a mission.
There you go. Nice. Yeah, the student project, I was really impressed, this group of undergrads. And they were the what's their title? The Knights for Animal Rights group. So these are definitely like an animal rights group. They were super into this project, and they actually made phone calls to all of the like R1 research institutions across the state system. And most of the committee chairs are listed by name with an email address. And then every IACUC has its own email address that you can reach out to. But for the most part, there's not full transparency anywhere. And that makes some sense because we're trying to balance out this perceived risk and potentially real risk to researchers and laboratory animals against the need for transparency from an ethics perspective.
Like as if the research should be private and not open to the public.
Yeah, I think given its way, IACUCs and institutions would have a really strong sense of self-preservation, and they'd be like, if we share any data about our IACUCs, that opens the door for like PETA activists to show up and break into our labs and harm our reputation and our students and our faculty. And there have been instances where like individual researchers have been, vehicles have been firebombed. There are at least 2 I can think of back in the 80s. So it was a real risk at one point. So yeah, I think given their way, they would have no information at all. But the transparency, for all the reasons we've talked about today, the transparency is so important ethically and let's say societally at the institutional or broader level, that at the community level, that some visibility is important. So you can email our IACUC. I think it's just IACUC@ucf.edu. It goes to our chair, and then something happens. They might write back to you, they might not. But, and there's a reporting structure. So our IACUC reports to our every institution has an institutional, forget the federal acronym, but some person in charge of compliance. And at that, in IACUC's position, is our vice provost for research. So there's a reporting structure in place too. So it's not wholly opaque. It's just, it would be nice to, a lot of committees list the types of members they have, even if not by name. And I think that would be useful too.
Yeah.
That's my lowest bar. If UCF just said, we have 3 animal researchers on the committee, that's a form of transparency that I think is super helpful. Because then people are going to be like, okay, like
You got some gaps.
yeah, you got some gaps, but you're telling us you've got gaps.
Yeah.
Right? And maybe you're giving us a reason for that. And that would be fine with me too. Like I like reasons. I think
most
just-
philosophers do.
yeah,
Their problem.
it is a problem. It's true. The other thing to say is out of this podcast, there's a new city module available. And Ian and Josh, we all have to do city training of various kinds at various points. There has been an animal care and use committee city training available to all of us for a long time, but apparently this 3 R's one is new. And I don't know anything about it except that it's for sale. So if you're not part of an institution already with a contract, you get the privilege of paying $100 or something to learn about animal welfare and get a little certificate for city.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a thing too.
Make sure I
Have
do it
you
before
done-
there's institutional affiliation.
Yeah, if you're interested, yeah, just do it and get the certificate.
Jonathan, have you done any of the have you done that particular one, the former CITI IACUC training?
I started it when I thought that I would it would help motivate my case to be on the IACUC, but when I got the firm no, I stopped. It's importantly long training, right? So it takes commitment to like work your way through.
Yes, I've done it a couple times.
Okay. Yeah.
And unless they've changed it again, I think it was mostly focused on medical research and psychological research. So like lab mice specifically, which meant 99.9% of it had nothing to do with any sort of ecological research.
Did you find anything in there that was relevant to your potential use, your field's potential use?
I think maybe it just really hit home the importance of like keeping track of numbers, which as someone who's doing research, I'm doing that for the data anyway.
Right.
But as I was listening to the podcast, I did notice that 3R certification. I jotted that down. I was like, I wonder if this is an improvement or if it's just another way for them to make some money.
Yeah, I would love to know that too. There is I ran into this last year at the Practical and Professional Ethics group, but there's a group of folks in the UK who are working on alternative to city training for reasons just like these, to broaden things out a little bit from the biomedical context. So I've got hope that compliance trainings and the regulations that support them will shift over time, but it seems like it's a slow burn. I haven't had any success on the IRB side either with like secondary data use questions. They're just like, yeah, we're not there's no regulations to help us deal with that. So you're on your own, which is interesting.
Can I ask something that's a little derailing the topic before we close out our?
Sure.
So I'm wondering, which as an environmental person more than medical person, SeaWorld recently was kind of on blast in the media because of 2 manta rays that died. They paid another party to fish a manta ray from the ocean. Yeah, and then
Okay.
it was for SeaWorld in not America. I don't remember where it was.
Okay.
A different SeaWorld.
Yeah.
And it died under the care of I think it might have been an FAU professor. I don't remember. It died under the care of a professor though in the Keys. And then another one, there were 2 manta rays. And so of course we all remember Blackfish. I have a friend who loves SeaWorld and is also an ecologist, and she's pro SeaWorld for their research, and they apparently do like some ecological activism or animal activism stuff
Yeah.
for biodiversity.
Yep.
And I was personally like, I threw her the manta ray article and I was like, how about that? And she had this whole conversation with me. She's like, it's not SeaWorld, it's the middleman. There needs to be laws in place that prevent these kind of things from happening. SeaWorld is one example, but this kind of behavior isn't exclusive to SeaWorld. So yeah, I'm just kind of wondering in that perspective, like, does SeaWorld have a place to catch a manta ray from the ocean and fly it over somewhere else, or like for what? Is SeaWorld's activism like neutralizing its damage or like making it balanced?
Yeah, SeaWorld is such an interesting case because it's not exclusively a rehab facility. So it's not like they can make the argument that it's an unreleasable manta ray and they've got a whatever. It's a science education facility, I guess, and an entertainment facility. So their animals are there as representatives of a species they claim, and that is leading to conservation efforts. So it's a sacrifice, similar to a lab, right? You're taking this animal out of the ocean, putting it at risk, obviously, sometimes mortal risk, putting it under conditions of stress for the rest of its life, with the idea that it's going to represent its species to the public and help with broader conservation. I feel like there's a real strong analogy to what we're doing with animals in research, where we're saying, like, we get it, like, chimpanzee research is bad, or let's strike that one. Oncomouse research is bad, but we're breeding these mice because it's going to cure cancer down the road. It's a sacrificial animal for the betterment of society or whatever. I think it's the same kind of argument. So I don't know what to do with either of those, because I think just personally, I don't think the premises are very strong.
I agree, especially if SeaWorld's like, oh my God, we're so sorry about those orcas. We can't release them though because they're gonna not survive. And then capturing more animals is like, okay, well, you're gonna have the same principle, even though a manta ray won't have the same, emotional capacity that an orca will.
Yeah.
But
I think a lot of SeaWorld's messaging has been trying to push the conservation angle, right?
mhm,
Like, we hear you, Blackfin. What we're doing to those two animals or whatever it is really bad. Like, we'll even admit that.
yeah,
And yet, in the bigger picture, bigger ecological picture, bigger species conservation picture, it's a good. And so it's a real like utilitarian trade-off where we're like, yep, we're sacrificing these welfares for the sake of all these other welfares. But I think it's really hard to see all those other welfares, and those two sufferings are very obvious.
mhm,
And I think that's a perennial challenge.
Yeah.
And it's the same when like when if you knew what was happening in a research lab on campus, you might be like, that's horrible, right? You're euthanizing 50 mice a semester for a study. I had a friend at another institution in the Northeast doing his PhD in biomedical science, and his first job was to behead pinkies with shears, baby mice, because he was doing drug dispersal studies in brains. And so like every day he just sat there at the bench, like lopping heads off pinkies and dissecting brains. And he said like he could barely do it on the day-to-day. And the only way he could is he put a picture of a child of a friend of his with a neurological disorder that he was studying, and thinking like, this is why I'm doing this.
yeah,
But that immediacy is the only way I think that you make it happen. And so yeah, I think if most of us saw what was happening in lab with no context, we'd be like, how horrible.
yeah,
So again, if the transparency is there, like we're doing this research, we recognize it's causing harms, whatever, to individuals, but look at this bigger picture. I don't know if that would shift people's opinions or not.
it's
But
very
it would help.
Frankenstein. It's very like behind the scientist was actually like a deep passion and big gothic sad heart. And
Yeah,
or
there
like
you go.
there's a show, I'm not sure if you've seen it, Fall of the House of Usher, based off of Edgar Allan Poe short stories.
Yeah, okay.
When they did Telltale Heart, it was a woman who was trying to create something like a heart monitor thing because her father had a neurodegenerative disorder. And so she was doing it on chimpanzees and she wasn't supposed to. And so there was a very interesting scene involving a chimpanzee. It just calls, again, where it's like underneath all that research, it's never just sociopathic cruelty. It's actually a deep need for something else to be addressed.
I hope that's the case. I mean, IACUCs are supposed to defend primarily against sociopaths. Those people who, because of stress or neurological conditions, are going to like intentionally abuse animals. And it's also supposed to support best practices, and everything else should be fair game. They're there to support science. I love the idea that all of these animal researchers have big gothic dark hearts.
Yeah.
So
Well, yeah,
it's a good-
Frankenstein and Telltale Heart. Those are both
Yeah.
quintessential Gothic
There
literature.
you go.
So
Yeah.
you got
Closing
1
remarks,
minute,
Joe?
boys.
Yeah.
Well, it was a good conversation. I sat on the sidelines a little this time, but
I love it. I love it. Dr. Kissel, Dr. Biazzo, thanks for being here. I really appreciate spending time with the both of you. And Gretchen and Sable, thanks for being here too.
Yeah, likewise.
John.
Good to
Yeah.
meet you both.
It was a pleasure
see you
meeting
next time.
See you next time.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.